Two towering figures of British politics are here to discuss Britain's membership of the European Union. And to chair the discussion, I welcome an old friend, ITN's Alistair Stewart. Thank you.
Simon, thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to you. The journey from a peace-bolstering post-war trade partnership via a core belief in the free movement of goods, labour and capital and a single market to the emergence of something approximating to a state in its own right has been hard. The ambition of moving towards an ever closer union is the central stumbling block for many. Well, by the end of 2017, and for the first time since 1975, we will all be given the chance to say if we wish to stick with that journey or dismount. As an economy, the EU is the largest in the world. Approaching half our exports go to the EU, a little more than half of our imports come from there. Despite that, the in-out debate has raged for decades. Part economic, intensely political. And as Simon said, this morning we have two giants of that debate with us. The former Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Lawson, recently appointed President of Conservatives for Britain, a pro-out organisation, and the former Labour Trade Secretary and European Commissioner, Lord Mandelson, a passionate supporter of the inside. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome to the stage the Lords Lawson and Mandelson. The rules of engagement, and time is against us, I know, but each of my guests will have 5 minutes to put their case to you. I then have a couple of questions for them, and I've got time for a couple of questions from the audience, and then each of them will be given 2 minutes to sum up and try and win your hearts, souls and minds before moving on to the next session. So first of all, may I invite Lord Lawson to put his case. Nigel Lawson, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Alistair, and good morning, everybody. They say that confession is good for the soul, so I will begin with a confession. More than half a century ago now, before I went into politics, when I was a journalist writing largely about economic policy issues, I was a member of a small group of like-minded journalists who met and dined from time to time and invited a leading politician of the day to talk informally and completely privately to them. And on this particular occasion in the late Andrew Schonfield's house in Chelsea, our guest of honour was the then leader of the opposition and leader of the Labour Party, Hugh Gaitskell. And the issue obviously came up, because this was, as I say, more than half a century ago, about whether we in this country should join what was then known as the common market. And I was in favour, and Hugh Gaitskell was passionately against. And his argument was this, that what this is all about is the creation of a full-blooded political union, a United States of Europe, and that is something which Britain can never join. And he argued this passionately, and I contested this. I said to him, of course there's a political dimension to all this, but it is not about full-blooded political union in the United States of Europe. Well, my confession is that Hugh Gaitskell was right. That is the nature of the European venture. That is what it was all about. And it is difficult for the pragmatic British to take this on board, and it's particularly difficult for British businessmen to take it on board. But economics takes second place. Of course, they want a good economy if they can get one, but it is the political project which is overall driving it. And that is what ever closer union is about, which is the creed, which is theology of the European Union. It does, I think, show a contempt for democracy, because it is a project of the elites of Europe. It is not what the great majority of the people of Europe wish to see, but then a contempt for democracy is one of the most prominent and least attractive characteristics of the European movement. However, since this encounter with Hugh Gaitskell all that time ago, there has been a watershed. And the watershed was the creation of the common currency, the single currency, the euro and the eurozone. And that has changed. That's a watershed in two ways. First of all, it has been a disaster, of course, for the European Union, or those members of the European Union who are members of the eurozone. But it's a disaster because it cannot work. And I made a speech in January 1989 as Chancellor at Chatham House pointing this out. It cannot possibly work, and it hasn't worked anywhere in the world ever. It cannot work without a fiscal union, and you cannot have a fiscal union without a political union. And that is, of course, what they intended. That is what my old opposite number, Jacques Delors, intended, that if you take this step, you are bound to go to a political union to make it work. But there's a watershed in another way, because it's the creation of a Eurozone bloc vote, which increasingly means that Britain is marginalized, which we have no influence, as we have had from time to time, on European Union affairs in the past, because of we will always be outvoted by the Eurozone bloc. There is this, as I've mentioned, this appalling democratic deficit in the nature of the European Union, but there is also correspondingly a bureaucratic surplus. It is an out-and-out bureaucracy, and it is made worse by the fact that, of course, for the members of the High Command of the European Union, more Europe, as they put it, is always a good thing. And more Europe means too often more European regulation. And there is the best estimate of the regulatory burden for Britain of EU regulation is of the order of £25 billion a year. And it is this regulatory burden which is getting worse and which we cannot oppose, which is the biggest damage to British business and industry at the present time, and therefore to the British economy. David Cameron has identified the fact that the commitment to ever closer union is a real problem. But he says he will secure an opt-out. That is completely meaningless. We have a de facto opt-out at the present time because we've opted out of the single currency. But that doesn't mean that the European Union will not, in search of further steps towards the ever closer union, legislation and regulation which we will not be able to oppose, or if we do oppose, we will not be able to succeed in our opposition.
Can I ask you to make your final point?
So would it be a disaster if we went out? No. We export a lot to the European Union, but other countries outside the European, their exports have been going faster. And people who say it would be a disaster, the same people who said it would be a disaster if we didn't go into the Eurozone. Nobody else argued this more strongly and eloquently than Peter Mandelson, but in fact it would have been a disaster if we had gone in. We must not be little Europeans. We must recognize that our destiny is global. That is where the markets of the future are growing fastest, and that is where our history tells us we should be. When I wrote this first in the Financial Times, in the Times, 2.5 years ago, a day or two later, Wolfgang Münchau, the European Union columnist for the FT, wrote an article with a commendatory headline, "Lord Lawson is right," and he concluded with these words: "There may be reasons why Britain should remain in the European Union. Whatever they are not economic, and that is the fact." Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Trying to tell one of the top journalists of our generation and a former Chancellor of the Exchequer to wind up is not easy. Ladies and gentlemen, would you now please welcome Peter Mandelson.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Nigel's argument is that Britain's position in Europe is dire. Attempting to reform the EU is futile, and our prospects outside the EU are golden. Well, my views are very different. That our existing EU membership brings real benefits. We have a good chance to make the EU better, and the alternatives are certainly worse. I'm not blind to the EU's problems. I'm a former member of the Commission. I've been there. I've got the T-shirt. The EU tries to do too much. It needs to do less, better. We have to fight to make it economically more competitive and its whole operation less centralized. And it is in danger of going ahead of public opinion across the continent in trying to integrate Europe further. This isn't just a British view. Of course, we have always been happy with as loose a construction as possible in Britain, but we are not alone in Europe in exhibiting integration fatigue at the moment, and we're not alone in itching for reform either. But here is the main point. While we in Britain want reform, there are facts about what we gain from membership of the EU that are true regardless of reform. That nearly half our trade is with other EU countries, not surprising as they are highly developed economies and our closest neighbours, and provide supply chains and production networks of which many British SMEs are part. The vast amount of our foreign direct investment comes from Europe because we are part of the same trade bloc, and much of the rest comes from international sources like the Japanese auto manufacturers who want unhindered access to Europe's single market and come to Britain in order to get it. And even when other Europeans come to Britain to work, and there are many in our country who object to that, they are mostly young and skilled and contributing to our economy, not sponging off us, and without whom our hospitality and construction industries, for example, would be struggling. Now, I know that anti-Europeans say that we could have all the benefits and more outside the European Union because the others need us more than we need them. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we need to get real. Only 6% of their exports in Europe come to Britain, compared to nearly 50% of ours to them. That's not a great starting point for a negotiation. If we exited and then asked for our trade privileges back, it would be on their terms, not ours. So while I think the benefits outweigh the costs of being in the European Union and that we need to safeguard these benefits, what about the prospects for reform? I am not dismissive of the Prime Minister's chances in the way that Nigel is. It's not going to be a cakewalk, that's for sure. But if you look at what the Prime Minister is asking for, whether our rights in relation to Eurozone policy making, or welfare entitlements of EU nationals, or a bigger role for national parliaments, Either we are firmly in the right and can persuade our partners, in my view, or many other member states already share our views. Now, there is more than one EU member, I can tell you, for example, wanting to see powers coming from Brussels as well as towards it. We're not alone in thinking that. But finally, ladies and gentlemen, what about the alternatives if we leave the European Union? This is where I think the anti-Europeans have most trouble. They say they want to be independent of the European Union, but still enjoy all the benefits of being in it. But it is not true, as they say, that we could simply leave the EU one moment and re-enter the single market the next. There is a simple way of understanding this. If we want access to the EU's market so as to maintain our exports, we have to pay for it and we have to obey their rules without influencing them. There's a straight trade-off, in other words, between the benefits we receive and the independence we have. And as for the rest of the world, we can, in theory, negotiate new trade agreements if Britain is no longer to be covered by the European Union. But we are a country, let's remember, of only 64 million people. Without Europe's 500 million strong market behind us, if we went into those negotiations, as I have done in the past, we would be settling on China's terms. We would be settling on India's terms. We would be settling on America's terms. That's the reality of the choice that we face. Notionally more independent if we came out, but more isolated and less influential as a result. And that's why, in my opinion, we are better in taking the benefits of our membership, working for reform, because the alternative, ladies and gentlemen, is very far from golden. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Peter Mandelson, how relevant is the single market for the vast majority of UK businesses, many of them here, who don't trade internationally, SMEs who are the lifeblood of a large part of the UK economy?
But Alistair, trade is changing. I mean, the days of creating finished goods in this country and then transporting them to the rest of Europe or to other places, of course, still happens on a vast scale. But what is equally important, and I think growing in importance, are the number of European supply chains and production networks of which we are part. That's not about creating a finished good and exporting it elsewhere. It's being part of a production process, part of a supply chain.
And for that, we need membership of the single market.
And those supply chains and those production networks are growing across Europe, and we are much more simply and easily and quickly and naturally part of those supply chains and networks whilst being part of that huge free trade bloc.
One of the strongest criticisms of your case, Nigel, is that one understands the politics of it and you changed your mind and looked at the ever closer political union, but you haven't crafted with great clarity what the post-Brexited model would look like, as it were. 2 years to renegotiate, Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon saying, oh, we'll sort that out for you guys and let you know what the deal is. Don't you owe these people a clearer model of what UK economy would look like post-exit?
What the UK economy would like post-exit is similar to what it is today, but stronger. The fear is a bad counsellor. It's understandable that people are afraid of the unknown, but the world is our oyster. It is the rest of the world that is growing faster. And Peter Mandelson's lack of self-confidence in this country was astonishing. And he said, we are so small. What do you think is the size of the American market for the rest of the European Union? which they're very interested in, the American, it is £300 billion a year. What is the size of their exports to the United Kingdom? It is £300 billion a year. We are as important to them as the United States is as a market, and they're trying to get a free trade agreement.
Are you a timid
we would have free trade agreements.
Are you timid
I
on
must say,
this?
I've never been described as timid.
You are not personally, but you lack in the British self-confidence.
But also,
They make great products. They provide great services.
let me tell you this. I am very proud of my country. I have always been a patriot. But that is precisely why I want my cake and eat it. I both want all the benefits of being in Europe and all the opportunities of trading with the rest of the world which we have. What on earth will be the point of looking out to the rest of the world for opportunities, uncertain but growing opportunities, but giving up the vast single market, the home market on our own doorstep? We can have both. Why do we have to choose?
We are not giving up the market. We continue to trade with them. The common external tariff is very small, about 3%. The rest of the world...
10%.
No, it isn't. It isn't. Outside agriculture, it's around 3%. And that is how
Look at
it
the
is
WTO.
that the rest of the world trades very happily with the European Union. The European Union is not closed to the rest of the world. In fact, because of our importance, I'm confident we could secure a free trade agreement. But even if we didn't, we would be far better off without this huge burden of European regulation, which is stifling our domestic economy.
Peter wants to go. No, before you do, no,
absolutely wrong.
This is a crucial point. Sunday papers were full of it. This business of Article 50 of the Treaty of Lisbon that says if the referendum by the end of 17 says we want out, whatever David Cameron has negotiated, and he's more optimistic than perhaps you are, but let's say the UK has said we want out, there's then a period of 2 years where the rules of engagement on tariffs, on trade deals, our relationship with external partners will be dictated by the member states who remain in. And we are told, handed down a piece of paper, what those terms are. Is that wrong or is that right?
It's wrong.
Factually wrong or wrong in principle?
That's right. In fact, it will be easier to get agreement, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most knowledgeable observers. It'll be easier to get agreement on the terms of our exit, because that doesn't require unanimity among all the member countries of the European Union. So it'll be less difficult to do that than it will be to secure the reforms that David Cameron wants, which treaty change does require unanimity among all the member countries of the European Union.
Nigel, any new treaty between Britain that has exited and the European Union would have to be ratified by the other 27 members of the European Union. But you made an absolutely seminal and staggering point. You said that if we came out of the European Union, we could go back into the single market without accepting any of the regulation of that single market. Nigel, go to Norway, go to Switzerland. You will see that those two countries that have their relationship outside the European Union, but with the single market, have to enforce every dot and comma of Europe's regulations.
Nigel.
Without being able to
Nigel Lawson.
Yeah. First of all, I didn't say that.
You did.
First of all, I didn't say that. Secondly, the Swiss and Norwegian economies are doing, in fact, pretty well, much better than the Eurozone economies. Thirdly, of course, if we're exporting to the European Union, we would have to accept their regulatory structure, just as when we export to the United States, we have to accept United States regulations. That is true across the world. But the domestic economy, which is the powerhouse on which the exports are based, which is over 70% of our total economy is the domestic economy, that would not be hamstrung by European Union regulation.
Final question to you, and then we'll have the two from the audience. Dave Cameron was a special advisor in the Treasury. You watched him come up and develop and what have you. Peter Mandelson said he was more optimistic than some commentators have been about Mr. Cameron's chances of success in these negotiations. What chance do you give him?
I think the chances of getting fundamental reform, the chances of getting the European Union to resile from this commitment to ever closer union, which means total political union, which, as David Cameron has said clearly, we were not prepared to be a part. I think they are small. The chances in a referendum, because of the fear factor which Peter and others are trying to promote, are pretty evenly balanced, I think. I don't know what the result will be. But I think the chances, regretfully, I would like to see the European Union totally reformed. But I think the chances of getting that are very slim indeed.
And the final question to you, Peter, and then we go to the audience, and then you both have 2 minutes to sum up. Nigel Lawson talked about your affinity for the euro, the single currency, and that's something that hangs over all of these people because they deal in pound sterling, but they are trading with a bloc that has the euro and all of its rules. Are you still pro-UK in Eurozone?
Heavens, no.
When did you have your Hugh Gateskill moment?
Well, I tell you my view. My view is that time, that moment came and went, and it's not going to come back. Look, I supported the government's policy at the time, which was to keep the option open. But the option closed, and given everything that has happened since, I don't see the British public reopening it. That's my view.
Okay, I've got 2 questions from the audience, and then also, because you're both giant brains, you have to listen to those questions and answer them, and also prepare your 2-minute summation in parallel, because we're now 2 minutes over.
Oh, God.
But we're doing grand, because none of them have walked out yet, which is always a good thing. Gentlemen, thank you both very much indeed to this point. Where is Rebecca Tregarthen? Would you find a microphone, Rebecca, and please address your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you very much indeed for a most lively opener there. That was marvellous. My question to you, what is the minimum David Cameron has to achieve in his renegotiations, both to satisfy his backbenchers and the country?
Thank you very much indeed. Rebecca asks, what's the minimum David Cameron has to achieve in his renegotiations, both to satisfy his backbenchers and the country? Peter?
First of all, there are 80, 90 odd Conservative MPs who will never be satisfied. They're not looking for a minimum, they're looking for out of the European Union. And therefore, to them, the negotiation is an irrelevance. But I think the answer to your question lies in what you think is the most important area of reform. I mean, I know that migration and welfare entitlements, although not a very big issue, objectively, is nonetheless a very big issue for the British public. This sort of canard about ever closer union is obviously very important for people like Nigel. But the most important issue for me, and it's bigger than any other, and that is establishing fair rules of policy making, decision making, between those in the Eurozone using the currency and those of us who are outside it. We are not going to go into the single currency, but we have to make sure that the way in which they make policies, take decisions and make rules do not adversely affect the rest of us in the single market.
So the
For me, that's the most important thing.
The minimum is basically about the relationship rather than the detail of free mobility of labour and what have you.
That affects directly our core economic interests, and it must be got right.
When you wrote your piece in the Times, coincident with you taking over the chairmanship of the organisation, you said you didn't want the xenophobes to take over, you wanted people with sound economic and political argument to lead the case. But by implication, you'd already made your mind up that the answer to her question is there is nothing that he can achieve to make us change our minds.
No, I think that theoretically, if there were, as I said, an explicit rejection of the object of ever closer union, and that for all these things, incidentally, fundamental treaty reform, as David Cameron has said, is required. Vague assurances are no good. There has to be treaty reform, and treaty change requires unanimity, as you know. So abandonment of ever closer union, the ability to negotiate our own trade agreements, the fact that European law, and this trenches on what Peter was saying, because European law is designed for the Eurozone, European law does not automatically applied to this country.
But Cameron's
And
not going to come back with
finally,
a reform of the 57 Treaty of Rome. That ain't on.
Well, it's not the 57, it's the Lisbon Treaty. But anyhow, and finally, the ability not to reject immigration, but the ability to be in control of our own borders rather than it being controlled by the European Union.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you very much indeed for your question. We are now looking for Mike Pearls. How convenient that you're there as well. Your question, Mr. Pearls.
It could have been organised. My question's short but quite a large question, which is what will the EU look like in 2040?
In
2040.
40.
40.
Ah, right,
Yeah.
fine. 2040, so goodness gracious me. Nigel, what do you think, whether we're in or out, what do you think it'll look like, Mike wants to know, in 2040?
Well, I don't know, and I shall never know because I shan't be alive then.
We don't accept that premise for one moment.
But I think that unless it changes, and the reason I want to see fundamental reform of the European Union is that this is what Europe needs. As you may know, I live in France these days, and I care about Europe, and this is the European Union as it stands at present is bad for Europe as a whole. So I hope that there will be fundamental reforms. I'm not optimistic.
And on that key point, you agree with him that we're not a solo voice, that there are other European colleagues who share that view and want genuine reform?
Unfortunately, it is shared by the European people, but not by the European elites.
Okay. Finally to you, and then we'll come back for the summation. What do you think it might look
And
like
I think
in
that
2040?
by 2040, it will be the public who have the last word, not the elites, as we've seen in countless European countries recently, and that will continue to be the case. Look, Nigel thinks that by 2040, he said this in his article in the Times last week, that we will be facing one nation in Europe. That's what the sort of Europhiles want, he says, a United States of Europe. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I have worked in the European Union. I have worked and represented every member state of the European Union. I cannot think of one country in the European Union that wants to give up its nationhood. Not one. Germany doesn't want to cease being Germany. France doesn't want to cease being France. Italy, Spain, the same. And therefore, the idea that by 2040 or 50 or whatever it is, that we are going to have created a United States of Europe, Nigel, is completely fanciful. In my view, we will have, roughly speaking, the same sort of EU as we have now, probably closer integration in the Eurozone, but that doesn't obviously include us. But for Europe as a whole, probably, if anything, a looser construction rather than a tighter one, because that's the way public opinion is going.
Right, while you get your head together for your summation, your prediction, come that referendum by the end of 2017, how confident are you that you will win the day?
I think it is...
It's a close run thing at the moment.
I think it will. That's all I can say. It'll be a very close run thing. I think certainly nothing like 1975,
Sure.
which is a different era altogether, when there was a 2-to-1 majority in favour of staying in, and I was among those who voted to stay in 1975. But I think it'll be very close, and I can't say more than that.
Thank you very much indeed. And Rebecca and Mike, thank you both very much indeed. To sum up then for 2 minutes, ladies and gentlemen, Peter Mandelson. From there, if you like, or wherever you like.
Okay.
Yep.
Look, ladies and gentlemen, I am not a starry-eyed, pro-European. I am pro-European for very, very British, pragmatic reasons. And I line up behind anyone else in arguing the case for reform of the European Union. I've been there, as I say. I know what needs to change, indeed. I'm not lining up behind anyone else. I'm at the front of the queue making this argument. I was when I was in Brussels. But let's look at the fundamentals. Britain is right to stay in the European Union because it makes us stronger, better off, and safer. Yes, security does come from working with others, from being in partnership not just with our partners and allies in NATO, but also in the European Union. And being part of Europe makes us stronger economically, because being in Europe is good for business, it's good for trade, it's good for investment, it's good for jobs, and it's good for consumers. I think that there's a simple choice, ladies and gentlemen: a stronger economy and Britain stronger in the world versus the risks and the uncertainty of leaving and the loss of influence that would come with our exit. To my mind, that's a no-brainer, but you, like everyone else in the British public, will make up your own view when the referendum comes. Thank you.
Peter Mandelson, ladies and gentlemen. And finally, Nigel Lawson.
We're running late, Alistair, so I shall be very brief indeed and just make 2 points. First of all, Peter said this is not about political union at all. This is not about creating a full-blooded political union in the United States of Europe. In fact, the European Union in 2040 will look very much like it is today. Well, in fact, he is wrong, and Hugh Gaitskell was right all those years ago. But in fact, if he were right, they should have no difficulty in abandoning the shibboleth of seeking ever closer union. Because if Peter is right, that is redundant, that is not part of the picture. Well, we'll see whether they do. If they do, I will be very pleased. My second point is this, and I am so glad to hear Peter's recantation of his insistence that we should join the euro and the eurozone. Time and time again, I recall him saying that if Britain didn't join the euro, this would be a disaster for our country. He's now changed his mind. He now says if we left the European Union, it would be a disaster for our country. Ladies and gentlemen, he was wrong then, he's wrong now.
Ladies and gentlemen, the green room is going to be a gem. Would you please... Nigel is right, we have overrun, and Simon Walker will beat me to a pulp, but this is one of the key issues for you as businessmen and women, for all of us who care passionately about our country. What a brilliant start to your convention, and what a brilliant couple of additions to your debate, whatever your view is. As we leave the stage, would you finally thank, once again, Peter Mandelson and Nigel Lawson, and thank you for having us.